In China, an explosion devastated the port of Tianjin near Beijing. The blast was large enough to be seen from space, registered on the earthquake scale,
Eyewitnesses who saw them said it was a nuclear explosion.
and detonated with the force of over 300 tons of TNT.
Tianjin is a port city that's about 84 miles southeast of Beijing. Even though it's so close to Beijing, in proximity, it's actually still its own metropolis. There's about 11 million people living in Tianjin. Tianjin is really Beijing's access to the sea. It allows goods from ships to be brought to land via Tianjin and straight to Beijing. It's really quite a commercialized port. I know a lot of different businesses work there or use it to import materials.
Tianjin is the largest port in northern China and one of the largest in the world, covering 121 square kilometers, making it vital to China's economy and status as the largest exporter in the world. Ruhai Logistics are based in the northwest corner of the port. They specialize in the storage, transfer, and distribution of hazardous chemicals.
Ruhai Logistics had a series of warehouses in the Tianjin port. To give you an idea of scale, it was about 10 football pitch size of warehouses, so it's a huge amount of warehousing.
Although this was a licensed chemical storage area, the quantity of chemicals stored there, and very dangerous chemicals, was far in excess of what was allowed. Some of the most dangerous chemicals, for example, potassium nitrate and sodium cyanide, which we know were stored at this plant, are limited to 25 tonnes of storage under legislation.
There were about 800 tonnes of ammonium nitrate. It's used as a fertiliser, it's also an explosive.
There was an excess of 800 tonnes of sodium cyanide on that site and over 1,300 tonnes of potassium nitrate.
Something like 3,000 tonnes in total of hazardous and toxic chemicals.
On the 12th of August 2015, we started hearing these reports about this possible explosion that happened in China. So we started looking into it.
We know that there was a fire.
A fire started about 11 p.m, or it was reported sometime before 11 p.m.
Firefighters were called out to tackle a blaze in the port area.
At the time, it wasn't known what was actually being stored there.
The initial fire was fought with water. The people who were fighting the fire didn't realise that the chemicals stored would react violently with water. The first explosion happened about 30 minutes later. 30 seconds after that, the main explosion happened.
These massive explosions.
There were fireballs which went hundreds of meters into the air and could actually be seen from space.
People described it a lot like a bomb going off. Eyewitnesses who saw the explosion said it was how they would imagine a nuclear explosion.
The effects went out so far that apartment blocks 2 kilometres away had their windows broken.
The force of the explosion measured 2.9 on an earthquake scale.
When the explosion happened, it knocked out power in a lot of these nearby buildings. Multiple story, tall apartment buildings. The lifts were all out. All the way up, there were people in the apartments. Doors that were, I'd say, several inches thick, they'd been blown straight off their hinges.
A very large number of people were affected either by flying debris or flame or by chemical releases.
A lot of people described smelling ash and being able to feel the heat from the fire that came off these explosions as well. Destruction everywhere because of the size of it and the cloud and the ash and the debris that all came flying as a result of it.
The tragedy is that most of the people who were killed were the people running towards the danger to make it safe. So they were the firefighters and the police who had been called to help their community and limit the spread. So there was a tragic loss of life, many of whom were firefighters, policemen and first responders.
We don't know the exact conditions that they stored the chemicals in, although it's reasonable to assume, seeing as they were illegally storing large quantities, the conditions weren't great.
When you're storing hazardous chemicals, the first and most important thing is you have to know what you're storing, you have to know what the dangers are, and you have to segregate. So that means not storing acids next to alkalis, not storing flammable materials next to explosive materials, not storing toxic materials, potentially toxic materials, next to flammables or explosives.
They were mixing chemicals which aren't very compatible next to each other, particularly strong oxidizers and fuels.
Segregation is incredibly important. Temperature control and ventilation is also very important.
The initial fire started because of an auto-ignition within nitrocellulose that was stored on the site.
Nitrocellulose is usually stored wet, submerged in either water or alcohol in order to prevent exposure to anything that could cause it to auto-ignite.
The nitrocellulose had been allowed to dry out, which is against normal practice, and once it dried out, it started its normal decomposition process. It built up heat, and when it reached 170 degrees, it auto-ignited. First responders came in, unaware of the other hazards that were around there, and tried to put this fire out with water.
Without any guidance as to what was inside the containers, the firefighters and first responders did what they would usually do, tackling the blaze and covering the surrounding area with large amounts of water to extinguish and prevent further spread of fire.
Now, some of the chemicals were there, particularly calcium carbide, would react very badly to having water played on it. The first responders appeared to have no idea what was stored on that site, which goes against all protocols. The effect of trying to douse this fire with water caused a chemical reaction. Not only did it produce a lot of heat, but then it produced acetylene, which is a very explosive gas, which led to this huge explosion.
The first explosion was so powerful it triggered seismic sensors and registered as a 2.1 earthquake. The second explosion was larger and registered as a 2.9.
The impact was like that of a missile. It does indeed look like a war zone. 114 people died here, 70 are still missing.
Over a year later, China sentenced 49 people for their involvement in those explosions.
In a site like this, there should have been an emergency procedure.
Asking lots of what-if questions. What if something went wrong? What would be your emergency response? Would you evacuate? Would you let the warehouse burn? Or would you actively tackle it?
There should have been somebody available to let them know what was in different areas of the site. There should have been an emergency procedure.
Would you use water? Would you use foam? Would you use extinguishing gases? All the questions that weren't asked by Ruhai Logistics.
So emotions will continue to run high until the full truth is known.
In the aftermath of the incident, the government did tighten up the legislation. In particular, they brought in new rules requiring anybody holding these dangerous chemicals to notify local authorities of the quantities and location. These rules were rescinded less than 2 years later because they were seen as unnecessary red tape. The failures here are institutionalised problems.
The regulations that existed before 2015, had they been observed, this accident would be much less likely to have happened and the consequences would be much less severe. The company was operating without due regard for the hazards of the materials that it was handling. All accidents are preventable. It's perfectly possible to handle hazardous chemicals safely. In this case, every single rule of safe storage and handling of chemicals was violated. The amount being stored, the lack of segregation, the lack of any plan to deal with a fire or an emergency, the lack of training for the people working in the warehouse, the lack of training for the emergency response teams, all meant that a minor accident soon got out of control.